This video is about RV Trip Wizard settings. There are two settings. A default settings that every trip derives its information from. This can be found by clicking on your name in the upper right hand corner and choosing default settings. And we'll look at these in detail in a moment. Notice that the header here is basically turquoise, and this indicates your default settings as mentioned. All new trips will derive their initial settings from this menu. Within each trip, we also have a trip settings menu. You can access that by clicking on the wrench icon and choosing trip settings. And these are identical, and not every setting is in here, but we'll go over that in a moment. The reason for separate trip settings is so you can customize your settings based on your trip. Most of the time you're just going to leave them as is. You have your RV height and weight, and we'll look at that real quick. You have your RV specifications in here, and we'll go over each thing in depth. But for the most part, you're not really going to change anything for each trip. But that can change if you're renting an RV perhaps, or if there's something about your trip that's different. Maybe it's a different style of trip or different locations where you might want to change some things. You have that customization available for each trip that you take. So let's go over all those settings in detail. When you first launch RV Trip Wizard, you're going to need to, and you're going to be prompted to establish your default settings. And bear in mind that when you change your default settings, they don't change your existing trips. Every new trip will be prompted, but existing trips, for example, this demo trip that I have open, if I go change my default settings, it will not change my demo trip settings. But let's look at those default settings first. You'll click on your name in the upper right hand corner and choose default settings. The first option is the general menu. Very simply, a couple of quick settings here. The map resolution, whether you want to hover or click for details, and whether you want to auto load the last trip. These are the settings I prefer and I've chosen. Most often these are the best. These are fine. The auto load could be handy as you're constantly working on a trip. The only caveat to that is if you create something unusual or inordinately long or cause some kind of an issue for that trip to load, you can kind of get yourself in a loop there. So these are the settings I prefer, especially if you're working with a touchpad. The hover doesn't really work on a touchpad very often, whereas a computer or a laptop, your mouse can hover over something. However, on a touchpad, you need to touch it. So click for stop details is probably more apropos there. High resolution map, of course, in most cases. If you're on a really slow connection for some reason, perhaps go to the low resolution. And the RV info, of course, is vitally important. You can look up some RVs here, and you can work your way through that menu, pick a motorhome. Let's say I have 2015 Tiffin, Phaeton. New ones are typically going to be here. Some of the older models are not. If your exact RV model or make or year isn't listed here, or if there's nothing relevant to your model, then just use the manually input RV info mode and put those numbers in manually. You can see that it defaults my length to 42, 6.5, and my weight, I know from measuring that to the back of the ladder, I'm really 43 feet. And I've weighed multiple times, and I'm a lot closer to 36,500. So the rest of this is fine. Obviously, your fuel of choice, even if you're driving a truck and pulling a trailer, you want RV Trip Wizard to let you know when you're going to get fuel. So go ahead and choose this. Put in your gallons. Fuel reserve does not mean you have a reserve fuel tank somewhere. It means how much fuel do you want to leave before Trip Wizard warns you of needing fuel. As a motorhome owner, of course, any of us with motorhomes know that we shouldn't let our fuel tanks get below 1/4 of a tank, or our generator will stop working. So I will leave 25 gallons and I give myself just a slight buffer there at 30 gallons. Fuel economy is 8, as is fairly typical for most. Technically, in the winter, mine could be a little lower. If I'm burning a lot of diesel fuel, you can see up here I do not carry propane. This is an important setting dealing with certain tunnels and restrictions, things like that. But as I do not carry propane, I tend to burn a little bit more diesel fuel, so sometimes I'll drop this to 7.5. But for the most part, we can all put 8 and we won't be wrong. But put what you know your fuel mileage to be. It's really important to get that correct. And then here I can choose whether to have no fuel warnings, 1 fuel warning, or multiples. I'm going to go ahead and select multiples here. Under routing and driving, of course, I want RV routing. I want that safe routing. About the only thing I really want to avoid is unpaved roads. Over here, I'm going to use my average driving speed, and I'm going to put 55 miles an hour. Now note this little pop-up that comes up and says, this is not how fast are you going on the freeway. This is overall, within the scope of a day's drive, what did your average driving speed come out to? And I can tell you most of our members will put 50, 55, or 60. And you can always calculate that at the end of a day and figure out what works for you. If you have kids, you may be stopping more frequently, or pets. If you don't have either, you may be stopping less and your average speed is going to be higher. I've learned that 55 works well for most people, frankly, and it certainly works well for us. The second option I need to choose here is my driving radius, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we look at the map. We have the new Show Advanced Driving Circle. Obviously that's not much of a circle, but it is circular in shape, and this is what I'm going to choose. This is very accurate. And then I prefer a single ring based on the number of hours I want to drive. Now I know 5 hours is how much we want to drive, because I know with stops that's going to turn into 6 hours. And if I'm leaving a campground at 10 a.m., I want to be at the next campground by 4 p.m. And so that's my 6-hour day, hence 5 hours of driving. You can put whatever works for you. If you're alternating drivers and you're stopping very little, you may want to drive 8 or 10 hours, whatever. Or we could come down here and choose miles. I may want to have a range of mileage of 200, say 250, and 300. Here again, the goal of this is to draw a ring, and you can see this 3-colored diagram here is indicative of what I have below. Draw where I'm going to be at the end of my driving day so that I know where to look for a campground. Here again, if you are a stickler to specific mileages, the best idea is to put your target mileage in the middle, and then our marker before and after, so you can kind of get a little pocket, a little window of opportunity as to where you might want to stop. And we'll try to look at that again. And we do have, and we'll be creating an updated diagram on the driving radius, or an updated video, on the driving radius, so you'll be able to watch that as well. We're going to go ahead and stick with my 5 hours, and we're going to stick with that setting. Here on expenses, this is simply a roundabout budgeting number for your expenses. Campgrounds, you might stay at a COE or a BLM campground that's $5 or $7, or you have a discount at Thousand Trails, maybe you're spending $15, or you might be in Class A resorts that are $70, $80, $90 a night. Whatever your typical campground spend is, this is the number you want. I've kind of settled in on 40, and that works pretty well for the most part. And of course, TripWizard is going to calculate this out and help budget a number for you. If you don't want these numbers, put all zeros. That's perfectly fine. For meals, you can go 2 ways on meals. Some folks like to have that number, have that budget, Some just prefer to say, go ahead and look and put 0 and say, look, I'm going to eat whether I'm RVing or not, so I don't want that to be counted as an expense against me. So no problem. Miscellaneous can be 0. I don't know, if you have a tradition of stopping at Starbucks every morning, you might put $7 or $80, $5, whatever you want to put in here as a miscellaneous expense that you're going to incur every day. Here again, I've got that set to 0, and I prefer to keep my fuel at $3. Granted, there are times where $2 or $2.50 is fine, but again, we're talking about an overall budgeting number. These can be tweaked individually for exact numbers down the road, but this is a budgeting number, and so typically my $40 and my $3 is what I'm going to stick with. Here under the Membership and Preferences tab, this has 2 functions. If I only want to see specific campgrounds on my map, I can accomplish that here. I can select my preferred campgrounds over on the right, and I can check this box down here that says Show Only Preferred Campgrounds. In this case, I really just want all of them over there. I'm not really going to select them yet. About the only ones I don't have over there are campgrounds I won't be staying at. Military, a city park, probably not. Stuff in Canada right now. I can add any of these I'm not quite sure of. I can add over here to the right. And these ones, Canadians and city parks, military, these are ones I won't be staying at. One of the reasons for simply having them over in this menu on the right is that they'll appear on my map as colored icons instead of a bunch of generic green tent icons. So I kind of like to have them in this on the right here. Again, if I only want to see these, and you can, this is really useful if you say, for example, you're only going to stay at KOAs or only going to stay at Thousand Trails. You can have only those options here on the right, and you can check that box. Bear in mind, TripWizard will only show you those, so you don't want to forget you've done this, particularly in the sense of our default settings. So I'm going to go ahead and save all those settings, and that didn't really change my trip as mentioned, but all new trips will now inherit those settings. So let's look at the trip we have in front of us. If we look at our trip settings, and this is what we want to do now, is look at our trip settings. We'll click on the wrench icon and we'll choose trip settings. And we're going to find everything in here is exactly the same with the exception of the membership and preferences. That's a one-time deal, so it's not up here. I'm going to go to my general. We're going to see a slightly different menu, of course, in this regard, because now I have a trip name. I can have some specific notes about this trip if I want to. I can have this as an active trip, a tentative trip, or an archived trip. Generally, you're going to start with active or tentative. After you've taken a trip and you kind of want to save it, but you want to get it out of your way, you can make it an archive trip. Having a trip in active status gives you 2 specific benefits. You can check yes on the pre-departure email, which means you'll get a little email every morning or the day before you start a new trip, a new leg of your journey, that talks about what the weather's like and where you're going and things to do in that area and tips from other RVers, things like that. Those are only available on active trips. Active trips are also the only other trips or the only trips status that is viewable in the RV Life app. So active trips will show up in your app so you can navigate them with the RV Life GPS and Campgrounds app, whereas tentative and archive trips will not show up there. So that's important to know there for that. With our RV info, we have the exact same information. I have no intention of changing that, unless I was renting or something different. That's, again, we mentioned that as a possibility. With my routing and driving, here again, I don't have any real reason to want to change any of these things. This one actually was slightly different from a test earlier. We had 200. Initially, we had 250, and I put these this way so I can show you that. And our expenses, this is probably one of the most reasons you might actually alter a trip specifically. For example, We talked about how $40 was my average camping expense. Well, suppose I was planning a large trip to tour all the fancy Class A motorhome places in Florida or in Southern California. I might want to raise that camping fee to $100 a night. Or flip it on the other side. Perhaps I was going to go all COEs and BLMs, and my camping fees were going to be $10 or $5 or whatever that might be. Or perhaps we're going to be making a just a quick cross-country run, and my camping fees are going to be about the same, but we're going to eat out every night. We're not going to take time to stock up on groceries or cook meals. We're going to eat out every day. We might put our expenses for meals at $60 a day because this is just a quick run. A variety of reasons you might want to alter this, but that's why we give that to you. If you decide to make a change in the middle of a trip, like I've just done here, I'll click yes to go ahead and recalculate. And I'm going to save this. Now, this, of course, was this particular trip. Let's see what that looks like on a new trip. If I click New Trip, and we're just going to call this a test trip. We'll call this video test. And let's say I'm going Halloween day, end of the week, month, whatever. We'll click Create. And where am I going to start? I'll just use my location for now. You can start from anywhere on the planet, obviously, or at least the country or North America. Now, all TripWizard is doing here is saying, look, is there anything about your trip settings do you want to change? And I don't, so I simply click Save. You'll always get that with a new trip. You don't have to do anything special with it, but it's always going to prompt you, and you just want to hit Save. So let's go back and open the trip we were working with. And what I really just wanted to show you was a couple of the things with regard to the driving ring or the driving radius. Remember how we said that we were going to do a single ring of about 5 hours, and that's what that looks like. I know that if I turn on my campgrounds, that after the end of the day, if I leave Cherry Hill Park in Denver, at the end of the day, I'm going to be right here around this area. And so I'll want to find a campground somewhere in this area, whether I go a little bit longer and stay at this Waukene KOA, which has excellent internet, I might add, or maybe I want to drive a little shorter and stay here within my driving range. But I know that at the end of the day, I need to be around here. Now, we mentioned putting a little bit finer point on that with the mileage. So if we go into this trip only, again, these settings will not affect my default settings. These are the trip settings. Let's say I want to use miles. And now, to refresh that, we can see that at the 250 mark, which is what we thought felt like it was our midpoint, this is where we would begin looking for a campground. I can see at a glance that this Waukene is just over 300 miles. In fact, if I click on it, I get that verification right here, 305 miles. Or if I come down to the 250, we should be able to click on this one and see that it's just under, or 200, just under 200. We had our green set at 200, our yellow at 250, and our red at 300. So with a quick visual, I can have a good sense of where these campgrounds are within the scope of my journey. Again, if you're a stickler for mileage, then use that. If you prefer to go with the hours, we'll just go back and change it to our 5 hours and hit save. If 6 hours or 8 hours, again, whatever your comfort level is, that's what you set it for. But I know that at the end of the driving day, I'm going to need to find a campground somewhere around here. And I'll have to decide, do I want to drive another hour or do I want to stop a little earlier? And so that's how that settings for the driving radius affect you. Everything else here is pretty straightforward. We can show the classic driving radius, which is simply the as the crow flies circles. I'll turn the campgrounds off for just a moment. on a straight line like this is fairly accurate. It's reasonably accurate enough. But as you get into twists and turns and higher traffic areas, particularly in the Northeast and East Coast there, it's just not going to be as accurate. And so our team developed that advanced driving radius, which is fantastic. All of the other settings in here, you're just not likely to change. The important thing is not to get overwhelmed with it, because you don't need to customize any of this. Obviously, the two most important things from someone driving a motorhome that's larger than their truck or than a standard vehicle is you want to make sure you have your height and length and weight set carefully, and that you have your RV routing set to RV routing. Now, we did talk briefly about the fuel. You can see here I have this set to multiple fuel warnings. So if I come back and look at my trip, you can see that when I leave Cherry Creek State Park, I'm going to need fuel here, and I'm going to need fuel here in Louisville before I get to my KOA in Lynchburg. And if I chose single fuel warning, which is this one, it shows me my first fuel warning. Now, I'm still going to need fuel later, but it won't show it to me until I satisfy this fuel request. And when I add a fuel stop and add fuel to that, then it'll show me the second one. I don't think there's a right or a wrong here. I like kind of having the sense of where I'm going to need fuel. And there's a separate fuel video on fuel, how to fill up and fuel management. And if that hasn't been updated already, it will be. But that's an overview of the trip settings for RV Trip Wizard. Remember, you have those default settings that you set one time, and you have your trip settings that are available for every trip. If you want to permanently change the way you do something, change it in default settings first, and then change it in any existing trip that you have. All right, we hope that helps, and look for more speed training videos here on RV Trip Wizard YouTube channel.